Trump's America First trade war aimed to protect U.S. industries is backfiring. No one anticipated the explosive backlash that would ensue. America was blindsided, not by an enemy, but by its closest ally. Canada just unleashed a $110 billion energy bomb that is already shaking the U.S. market, threatening to drive up electricity costs and disrupt trade relations. This bold action has left economists, politicians, and citizens alike questioning the future of North American trade relations. But how did we get here? Let's unravel the events leading up to this monumental shift. Tariffs that triggered the storm. It all started with Trump's aggressive trade agenda, a strategy he proudly called America First. His mission was clear: protect American industries, bring back lost manufacturing jobs, and reduce reliance on foreign imports. But in his push to put the US economy first, he set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. In 2018, the Trump administration slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum, citing national security concerns. But these tariffs were just the beginning. Lumber, dairy, and even the auto industry, all major pillars of US-Canada trade, soon found themselves in the crosshairs. For Trump and his supporters, this was a necessary battle. They believed these tariffs would revitalize American production, reduce dependence on Canadian goods, and force trading partners to play by US rules. But while the White House saw this as a victory for American workers, economists saw a disaster in the making. This will backfire, they warned, and they were right. Canada, blindsided by what it saw as an unjust attack on its economy, didn't just retaliate with counter tariffs. Instead, it made a game-changing move, one that would reshape the energy landscape and leave Washington scrambling. What happened next would send shockwaves through the US economy, shake up global trade, and drive up energy costs for millions of Americans. The storm had begun. Canada hits back where it hurts most. Unlike the loud, headline-grabbing policies of Trump's trade war, Canada's response was quiet, calculated, and devastating. Rather than engaging in an endless tariff-for-tariff battle, Ontario found a weak spot in America's economic armor: energy. With a single policy change, they turned the tables on the US, hitting where it hurt the most: electricity. Canada imposed a 25% tariff on electricity exports to the US, a move that seemed almost surgical in its precision. At first, many dismissed it as just another tit-for-tat retaliation, but for millions of Americans, the impact was immediate and painful. For context, over 50% of the electricity in some northeastern US states comes from Canada. These states, heavily dependent on cross-border power, had no choice but to absorb the cost. Practically overnight, monthly energy bills in parts of the US spiked by $100 to $150. Homeowners felt the squeeze, businesses scrambled to adjust, and local governments were left searching for solutions to keep the lights on without breaking budgets. Canada wasn't merely pushing back against US tariffs, they were flipping the switch on America's power. In Washington, they never saw it coming. $400,000 a day and rising. As American households felt the sting of rising electricity bills, Canada was cashing in on the crisis. Every single day, Ontario collected $400,000 from the tariffs imposed on US electricity imports. Over the course of a month, that added up to a staggering $12 million, money that once flowed freely through trade but was now redirected straight into Canadian hands. For Ontario, this wasn't just about recouping losses from Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs. It was about leveraging power, both literally and economically, to make the US feel the consequences of its trade war. While American consumers paid more just to keep their lights on, Canada's energy sector thrived off the very policies meant to weaken it. At the center of it all stood Ontario's premier, Doug Ford, and he had no apologies to give. Ford didn't try to sugarcoat the situation. He made it clear Canada wasn't responsible for this trade war. Trump was. The American people didn't ask for these tariffs, but now they were paying the price for them. And if Washington thought Canada would sit back and accept economic pressure without retaliation, they were dead wrong. But this was more than just retaliation. This was a warning shot, a message to Washington that if they wanted to play hardball, Canada had the leverage to strike back where it hurt the most: energy. And with the US economy already feeling the strain, one question loomed over Washington: how much more damage was coming? The fallout across US states. The impact of Canada's $110 billion energy counterstrike wasn't just felt in Washington, it rippled across US states, hitting hardest where reliance on Canadian electricity was strongest. Michigan, Minnesota, New York, these states, once thriving on affordable cross-border energy, were now scrambling to keep up with skyrocketing electricity costs. Homes, factories, and small businesses all felt the pinch as energy bills ballooned overnight. For auto manufacturers in Detroit, this was a financial nightmare. Production costs surged, supply chains tightened, and fears of layoffs loomed over an industry that had barely recovered from past economic downturns. Dairy farmers in Wisconsin, already battling razor-thin profit margins, now faced an added burden. The cost of running equipment, keeping milk refrigerated, and transporting goods had never been higher. Even Republican governors, many of whom had once backed Trump's aggressive trade stance, were now raising alarms. The very states that helped elect him were now bearing the brunt of his trade war. They urged the White House to reconsider its stance. What started as an America First policy was now hurting Americans the most. Trump had started the fire, but now it was burning down his own backyard. The political backlash begins. The pressure was mounting, not just from the American public, but from Trump's own party. What began as a bold trade war strategy was now turning into a political nightmare. GOP lawmakers were divided. Some remained loyal to Trump's America First agenda, insisting that the tariffs were a necessary step toward long-term economic independence. But others, they saw the writing on the wall. With their own states suffering from energy price hikes and business closures, many Republican leaders were breaking ranks and urging the White House to reconsider its trade policies. Meanwhile, energy regulators were panicking. The sudden surge in electricity costs was wreaking havoc on power grids, and utility companies were struggling to balance supply and demand. Some states considered subsidies to help consumers, while others began exploring alternative energy sources, a shift that could permanently alter America's energy landscape. Democrats, on the other hand, seized the moment. They wasted no time shaping the new political narrative, using the crisis to hammer home a key message. Trump's trade war wasn't protecting American jobs, it was destroying them. With midterm elections looming, they saw an opportunity to turn voter frustration into political momentum. The conversation had shifted. This was no longer about economic protectionism or fair trade agreements. This was about survival, and Canada's counterpunch, it was working. Meet Mark Carney, Canada's new power player. The political tides had shifted. Canada had a new leader, but this wasn't just another prime minister. This was a financial powerhouse who knew how to move markets and shape economies. Mark Carney, with an impressive track record as the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney wasn't just experienced, he was a force to be reckoned with. He had spent years guiding economies through financial crises, managing inflation, and advising world leaders on trade. Now he stood at the helm of Canada's government, ready to take a calculated and unwavering stance against US tariffs. His message to Washington was crystal clear. These tariffs stay until the US learns to play fair. For Carney, this was never just about revenge or political posturing. This was about control. Canada had spent decades as a reliable trade partner, yet it had been sidelined and penalized as if it were an economic threat. Now, with billions at stake and the balance of power shifting, Carney wasn't just responding, he was setting the rules of the game. Canada goes global. While the US scrambled to contain the fallout, Canada was already moving forward. Fast. Washington remained locked in political infighting, but Canada, it had a new plan. Mark Carney wasted no time making his first major diplomatic visit, but it wasn't to Washington, it was to Europe. His choice was no accident. It sent a clear message. Canada was no longer willing to wait for US approval. The days of being America's quiet, dependent trade partner were over. Instead of clinging to an unreliable US market, Canada was forging new alliances. Carney was already in talks with European and Asian leaders, negotiating trade deals that would redirect billions in Canadian energy exports away from the US and into new, thriving global markets. For decades, Canada had been America's go-to energy supplier, but now it was building an energy empire of its own. What once flowed south to power American cities was now being rerouted across the Atlantic and the Pacific into the hands of eager buyers in Germany, Japan, and beyond. The US had expected Canada to fall in line. Instead, Canada was leading the charge. From oil to wind, Canada's green game plan. While the world focused on Canada's bold trade moves, another transformation was happening, one that would redefine its energy future. Canada was no longer just an oil and gas powerhouse. It was doubling down on renewables at an unprecedented pace. Across the country, solar farms, wind turbines, and hydroelectric projects were surging. Investments in clean energy had skyrocketed, with the government setting an ambitious goal: 30% of the nation's electricity from renewables within the next 5 years. This shift wasn't just about economic leverage, it was about climate leverage. By prioritizing green energy, Canada was positioning itself as a leader in the global clean energy revolution. While other nations struggled to balance economic growth with climate commitments, Canada was proving it could do both. For decades, oil had been Canada's golden ticket, a key export fueling its economy. But now, the future was different. With the US tangled in trade disputes and struggling to modernize its energy grid, Canada was charging ahead, becoming a clean energy superpower. Can the US afford to keep fighting? The reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The longer this trade war dragged on, the more the US had to lose. Inflation was rising. Everyday Americans were feeling it. Higher energy bills, increased costs for goods, and an economy that felt more unstable by the day. What was once framed as a bold economic strategy was now looking like a self-inflicted wound. Voter frustration was growing. Across the country, businesses, homeowners, and state leaders were demanding answers. Manufacturers warned of job losses. Farmers faced surging operational costs. Even Republicans who had once supported the tariffs were now openly questioning the strategy. Meanwhile, Canada was thriving. Canada was earning millions every day in energy tariffs, forging new trade deals, and strengthening its energy independence. It was no longer just America's biggest supplier. It was becoming a global energy force. The US had taken Canadian energy for granted. Now it was being forced to pay the price. If Washington didn't pivot soon, this wouldn't just be about tariffs. It would be about America losing its grip on the global energy market. The power has shifted. This was never how it was supposed to go. The trade war was meant to be one-sided, a demonstration of American strength, a warning to its closest allies that the US was done playing fair in a global economy it believed was stacked against it. Trump's America First agenda was supposed to reinforce US dominance, forcing trade partners to fall in line. But somewhere along the way, Canada flipped the script. What was once a quiet, cooperative neighbor had transformed into a global energy boss. One that wasn't just responding to US aggression, but outmaneuvering it entirely. The tariffs meant to weaken Canada's economy had instead accelerated its independence, pushing it to explore new markets, forge stronger global partnerships, and ultimately redefine its role in international trade. Canada had not only weathered the economic storm, but emerged stronger. It had shown the world that it didn't need US approval to thrive. And Trump, for once, he didn't see it coming. Now, Washington is faced with a difficult decision. Does it continue down this path, doubling down on a trade war that has already spiraled out of control? Or does it admit that the balance of power in North America has fundamentally shifted? Perhaps for good, because the real question is no longer just what the US will do next.